When many people think of palms, you think of, what do you think of when you think of a palm? You think of Hawaii. What about tropical jungles?
Yeah.
What about Florida?
Yeah.
What about someplace warm? How many of you think about the end of the Ice Age?
Not me.
How many of you think of plants that we normally associate with being tropical actually having lived in temperate climates that have pretty cold winters, mild springs and falls, and sometimes really warm or hot summers? Here in the southeast we have a number of native palms. These palms are not tropical, despite the cultural thoughts on these plants. Not all of them. Of the some 3,000, 2,500 to 3,000 species of palms, a lot of them are actually not tropical. In fact, some of these palms, if you were to put them in the tropics, would be very unhappy plants because they're technically temperate. And even though when we look at palms, and we see palms here in North Carolina, we immediately think, oh, Wilmington's kind of tropical. Wilmington is temperate, macrothermal, meaning a very mild temperate zone. And the palms that live there really are temperate plants, not unlike the oak trees and the maples and sweet gums and other plants that we have here in the southeast. They're not tropical. Here in the Botanic Garden we have a number of palms, most of which are native to the southern U.S., a few that have been brought in as ornamentals that are Asian, also a similar climate zone. And as we talk about some of these plants, we'll walk around and point them out. But as I mentioned, kind of at the break of the Ice Age, North America was home to a lot of really large mammals. And when we think of Africa, what's the biggest animal that's really impressive in Africa?
Lion.
Lions. North America had lions. North America had rhinos.
Elephant.
Elephant. North America actually had a number of species of elephants, and not that long ago. You know, we think of several thousand years ago as being a long time ago, but in the scheme of Earth's age, that's nothing. It's a blink of an eye. And when we look at palms, what we see oftentimes are these big fans or feather-looking leaves. Palms do not defend themselves typically with chemicals. We all know of plants that have poisons, they taste bad, they're toxic, they can kill you. Most of the world's species of palms really are quite palatable to herbivores. Those are animals that eat other plants. And with temperate palms, they had to deal with a lot of these large mammals. And there are different ways that some of these plants can defend themselves. They can defend themselves spatially by growing in a place that's hard to get to, or they can develop mechanisms that really make them unpleasant. And that's going to lead me over here to this plant. This is called the needle palm. It is a very ancient lineage of palms, native to here to the southeast. Most of the time they grow in these large impenetrable clumps, and they get the name needle palm because of these spines. When we look at the trunks of a lot of palms, they look like they're covered in this soft, fluffy burlap. Well, in the needle palm, that has been modified into these spines, so that was a defense mechanism for browsers that would try to eat the flowers or seeds. And for these elephants, like we said, North America had elephants. Imagine a trunk, a fleshy trunk, reaching in there to grab that plant, and you grab a fistful of a trunk that's basically like a botanical porcupine. So this is a defense mechanism for the needle palm. Needle palms are very cold hardy. They can grow, they've been known to withstand temperatures in the single digits, even down below zero. But for needle palms, one of the really interesting things about them, despite their cold hardiness, what we do know is that in order to withstand or survive winter, really cold winters, they need very hot summers, which the southeast offers exactly that. We get really hot, then we get really cold. So if you go to a cooler, wet environment like Great Britain, needle palms, even though the temperature is not the problem, the lack of that heating and also the high moisture and cool tends to kind of be an enemy. Here in the southeast, there's another group of palms called sabal palms. I would like to say it's pretty easy to name the species, but the problem is that many of the species have crossed and made populations that share attributes of other species, and that means they're of hybrid origin. And we're going to walk through and look at a few palms, a few more palms. And this one over here in the corner, let's take a look at this. This is Sabal Brazoriensis. It's native to coastal Texas, the Brazos River. And it possesses some characteristics that are like the big sabal palm tree, which is the state tree of South Carolina and Florida. Here in the Carolinas, they reach heights of about 20, sometimes 30 feet. In Florida, upwards of 80 to 90 feet. So the sabal palmetto can actually be a very large plant, but it has to be in a much more southern latitude to do so. Sabal brazoriensis has some of the attributes in that it will eventually form a trunk. It won't ever get as tall, but one thing about it versus sabal palmetto is very limited by temperature. They can handle cold temperatures, but once you start getting into the lower teens, anything below that for extended periods, sabal palmetto, the big palm tree that we see here in the southeast, they can suffer. A lot of times they don't survive. The brazoriensis sabal is a very, very cold hardy plant, so it brings the cold hardiness of another palm, the swamp palmetto, Sabal minor, which we'll see in a minute, and the sabal palmetto, and you get this really nice symmetrical, it's really a nice compact symmetrical palm. Eventually will form somewhat of a trunk. So the trunk, or caudex, is the part of the plant that elevates above the ground, and it's produced. How many have you seen the rings like in a palm tree? The trunk? Each ring is produced by a leaf, and the leaves kind of grow in a spiral, and that's what creates that ringed effect in the trunk. And so over time, as the old leaves, you can see the leaf sheaths, or the boots, as they shed, it'll leave a ring. Yeah. But this is Sabal brazoriensis, native to Texas. We're going to jump continents. We're going to look up. This is Trachycarpus. They're also called windmill palms. And here in the Botanic Garden, we have several species, varieties, and hybrids. I do know that we have Sabal fortunei or fortunii. I'm not Sabal, I'm sorry, Trachycarpus fortunei or fortunii. And this is a good example of it. You know, I was talking about that kind of burlap matting. There are a lot of thoughts on what that does. It's kind of an insulator against wind desiccation. It's also protects the trunk, and there are a lot of thoughts on what its functions are. I say whenever we look at one thought or one possible function, I think it's multiple. I think it serves a lot of different functions. But you know, when we're talking about the spines in the needle palm, it's derived from that same material. Trachycarpus are kind of interesting in that they are either male or female. So some plants bloom as only male, and others that are female require the presence of a male somewhere in proximity so that pollination can occur. Palms are flowering plants. They're very ancient flowering plants, and among their pollinators are primarily beetles, flies, small bees, certain groups of some of the smaller butterflies, and moths. So palms oftentimes solicit a lot of pollinators, but beetles seem to play a really important role with the success in pollination in a lot of palms. More Trachycarpus, windmill palms. And these are really good in, like, say, zone 7, zone 8. They don't like it extremely tropical. It tends to be a little too hot for them, too much sun intensity. They like moist, humid forests. And interestingly, these Trachycarpus do really well all the way up the Pacific Northwest to British Columbia. You wouldn't think of British Columbia, Vancouver, Canada, having palm trees. Trachycarpus do quite well there. Once you start getting out of, say, zone 7, into zone 6, that becomes a little more precarious for a lot of palms. And oftentimes it's not necessarily the temperature that they hit, but the longevity. How long are they exposed to those really cold temperatures? Because eventually the plant will freeze through, and when it does, it kills the bud stem, which is when you look at palms, it's a single bud and it's generating these leaves, but if it freezes through to that bud core, which is the problem that when we start zone pushing, trying to grow palms a little further north, a little higher elevation, eventually you hit that winter, like Texas did recently. And you know, Dallas, Texas, we're getting warmer, we grow palm trees, bam, one vortex winter, and thousands of palm trees are nothing more than dead telephone poles, because after a week's worth of temperatures that didn't get above freezing, their bud cores froze, their buds froze, they froze to the core. So when we talk about cold hardy palms, they're cold hardy within reason. They're not as cold hardy as are a lot of other plants. So cold hardiness is relative. In Central Florida, cold hardy would be an entirely different conversation than North Carolina, because then you're talking about things that can survive just barely out of Miami, but would never survive in South Georgia. So this one, really cool. It's another sabal palm. We're going to look at a lot of sabal palms. This is Sabal Birmingham. Birmingham, Alabama. There was a large sabal palm tree in Birmingham, Alabama that withstood very, very cold temperatures, and it was big, large tree, real robust trunk, large plant, and unfortunately, sadly, it was dug and moved in the winter during the cold, and the plant went into shock and it died. Which kind of leads me to a little bit when we talk about planting cold hardy palms, you want to do it in the spring, because they really kind of need that growing season to establish to make it through a winter. Despite the fact they might be cold hardy, they're still a little bit tender when it comes to colder zones. Another thing when planting a palm, if you get it in a pot, you know, with a lot of plants, we want to break up those roots, right? With palms, you want to really minimize root disturbance. Their roots are not like a tree or a woody shrub that's going to choke it. Its roots are a lot of fibrous roots, like grass. It's a monocot, like grasses, like the agave, like orchids. It's a monocot. So its root system is really not as complex as like a tree. It's a lot of little fibrous feeder roots that it doesn't need a lot of root disturbance when you transplant it or take it out of a pot. But anyway, Sabal Birmingham, very cool plant. No one really knows its origins. We know that it does possess traits that are intermediate. We hypothesize another hybrid. This is Sabal minor. Sabal minor is found all across the southeast. There were historical records of it in extreme southern Virginia, all the way to South Florida. This species extends all the way across coastal Texas, into the kind of the hill region of Texas, and all the way up into southeastern Oklahoma, below the Edwards Plateau. This is McCurtain's Sabal minor from Oklahoma. You don't think of Oklahoma as being a place you'd find a palm. Here we have Sabal minor. This particular form is from Oklahoma. Another really nice example of an older Sabal brazoriensis, and again, like I said, coastal Texas, Brazos River. These exist in a fairly small, naturally occurring population, but have become quite prolific in the horticulture trade. So they are much more widely grown and distributed now, but in their natural place of origin, pretty small range. In fact, they're considered kind of special concern in their native natural habitat. Another example of a Sabal minor. Sabal minor is a bit of a wild card, oftentimes hard to recognize because in the Florida Panhandle, very, very small plants don't ever get very big. Here in coastal North Carolina, some of them can get rather enormous. They share a lot of basic characteristics. The midrib or costa is typically pretty short. The plant has, if you're looking at the leaves, the plant has a pretty strong cleft. Pretend like my finger's the leaf, but right where my hands meet, the leaves have a pretty wide cleft going down the middle, as you can see here. That's a pretty characteristic trait for most Sabal minors. Again, you can see the big split. Right where this little costal vein ends, Sabal minor has a really big split. And that's pretty typical. Sabal minor is very cold hardy. They've been known to do quite well even in zone 6, although they don't naturally occur there. Zone 6 would be if you went a little further west in North Carolina, or you go up into like Western Virginia, start getting into parts of Kentucky, lower Midwest.
Is it higher than over the border?
It's colder. As your USDA zones increase in number, you're looking at warmer. Here in the Raleigh area, we are sitting right at the interface of Zone 7 and Zone 8. And as you get further south, you get into Zone 9. South Central Florida, Zone 10, even though Central Florida is closer to Zone 10 now, and then you get into the tropics, 11, 12. So Zone 6 would really be a colder climate. We'll walk over here. We've all seen the South Carolina state flag, right? On the state flag, there's the palm. In the state, their car tags, there's the palm. This is Sabal palmetto. And palmetto, the Spanish word for little palm, so it's kind of interesting that palmetto got applied to the largest sabal that we have here in the southeast. This is a young one. These are both young plants. Sabal palmetto here in the Carolinas, telephone pole sized, maybe 20 feet, 30 feet. In Florida, parts of the Gulf Coast, they've been known to reach heights of greater than 50 feet. And some recorded in Florida, 70, 80. I believe the champion was a little over 90. That's a very, very tall plant. And not a fast grower, but not as slow as some of the other species. So these are probably a good many years old. And in order to really have a trunk, you see some of these palms that are 15, 20 feet tall, that takes decades. It takes quite a while for them to get that tall. You can see we're looking at a fan leaf, but do you notice anything different about this versus Sabal minor? It's stringier. Sabal minor was a little flatter. This one has a much stronger bend in the middle and kind of folds in. And I don't know what to do with my other spine, but that's all right. If you look here, remember what I told you about the costal vein or costa? You see here how it's really long and arching in this one. It's, you know, in the Sabal minor, it was a little short thing that ended here. And in this one, you see how that's like that, a really long curve. Well, it's that long curve that pulls that fan out and then causes that fan to kind of fold and dip. That's a characteristic of Sabal palmetto that you won't see in a lot of the other Sabals. Very diagnostic. Another thing, do you see this little stringy? That's also typical of Sabal palmetto, and you're not going to see that in Sabal minor. But when we see it in other things like brazoriensis or Louisiana, it begins to kind of, that little, you know, flag in your mind thinking like, this might be a hybrid. It has a little bit of characteristics of other things going on. Sabal palmetto is a very cold hardy big palm, but they are not as cold hardy as, say, Sabal minor or the needle palm. So really for us right here, this is zone pushing. So they might do well for a number of years, but we could easily see what Texas saw, a really hard cold winter. And if you remember 2018 killed a lot of these, even native ones in coastal North Carolina, because North Carolina had not seen those kind of temperatures in 100 years. So the individuals that survived that survived the cold, that's how cold hardiness eventually in populations gets ingrained. Any survivor would then pass that on. Any of those that kind of went to the wayside because it was too cold, that removes them from the gene pool. So that's how over time some of these adapt to being colder or more cold hardy in populations than others. And certainly North Carolina Sabal palms would be cold hardier than things you get in South Florida.
So something that's in the correct zone would be able to survive the extremes of the heat and cold? Is that what you're saying?
Typically, yes. If the population has proven itself over time, naturally occurring, it's going to be better adapted like a native plant. You know, when we talk about natives, better adapted to our conditions.
Yes.
If it's a native plant, say to eastern North Carolina, it's certainly going to have a better chance of surviving just a little bit more inland in North Carolina than bringing something in from another part of the country.
Okay.
So when we look at cold hardiness in palms, I always tell people, look at the populations that are closest to the zone that you want to bring it into. And there are a lot of reasons that we want to do that. Florida, for instance, is now experiencing a mycoplasma disease called lethal bronzing that's spreading through all the Sabal palm species. And you know, that's a big concern for North Carolina, South Carolina, because a lot of Sabal palms that are planted as ornamentals are coming out of Florida.
Right.
If it's diseased, it could spread. So anyway, cold hardy palms. Palms are living things. When we think of Mexico, we pretty much think Cancun, Puerto Vallarta. We think coconut palms and beaches. Mexico is it's a center of biodiversity. It has more species of plants and animals than most other countries on Earth. In fact, it ranks very high.
Wow, I didn't know that.
A lot of species of palms occur in Mexico, but Mexico has some interesting attributes. You don't think of snow, you don't think of cold weather. Mexico has altitude, it has mountains, just like we do. They run through the country. In fact, there are several mountain chains in Mexico. This one is an eastern Mexican, but kind of dry scrub, upland habitat, kind of similar to some of the things you would see here in the southeast. This is Sabal spa Tamaulipas. It's from Tamaulipas, Mexico. Probably will be named as Sabal Tamaulipas. But you can see its leaves are really robust, has a little bit more curvature than Sabal minor. Sabal Tamaulipas, a Mexican species, does very well right here in Zone 7, Zone 8. Very cold hardy, and like I said, we've experienced temperatures here low teens, mid to low teens already this year. None of the palms we've looked at have really shown any damage. So can't really say anything bad about our native Rhapidophyllum, which is the needle palm, or native or near native Sabal species. One last little Sabal, and then I'll leave it open for some questions. There are other palms that are certainly worthy of trying. Mediterranean fan palms, we do have some of those here. The saw palmetto is also the southeast. Some of those populations might do quite well here, or at least survive. Not necessarily thrive, but survive. But I'm going to show you my favorite. I first saw populations of these in Louisiana, and being from the southeast, east of the Mississippi River, I'd never seen a sable that looked quite like that. It's very symmetrical. I think it's kind of pretty. A lot of people think sables are a little weedy, but it's very symmetrical. Got a nice round structure to it, a little bit of a trunk, kind of like sable minor, but it seems to have a little bit more symmetry. Another thing I like about this, these are pretty fast growing. You know, I said palms don't always break speed records in growth. I got one of these about 5 years ago from Tony. Put it in my yard, you know, the little size pots that we get them in. Put it in the yard 5 years ago, it's already almost this big.
Oh, wow.
And that's unbelievable because I also have sable minors that are the same age. You know, they're little, and they're native to North Carolina, but these are actually native to Louisiana and part of Texas, Gulf Coast, much further south than we are, so surprisingly very cold hardy, probably somewhat related to that brazoriensis when we talk about that hybrid complex. They certainly have attributes that seem intermediate. Some still consider this a sable minor, but interestingly they grow side by side with native sable minor in Louisiana. And there's just a stark difference. Whole populations of sable minors, and then there'll be a cluster of these they just stand out. They stand out in their shape, their symmetry, their size. I personally think it's a different species. Certainly a different population dynamic that doesn't seem to gene exchange as readily. But I really like these, and I tell people, when people ask me, I'd like a nice little palmetto for my yard that's going to be cold hardy. They can handle high sun. They can handle mid-intensity sun, dappled light, and they can do quite well in a really shady place. So Sable, Louisiana, a lot of tolerance for light intensity. They seem to be able to handle really moist soils to moderately dry. So, you know, different soil conditions, and certainly cold hardy. In fact, in 2018, my Sable, Louisiana did better than anything else in the yard. Absolutely no damage. So this is my favorite. When I think of native or near native cold hardy palms, I really am a big fan of Sable, Louisiana. So, and if there are any questions or at any other point in time folks want to know anything about palms, I'm happy to talk about them. Again, what's the best time of year to plant a sable palm?
Spring.
What's the best time of year to plant any palm?
Spring.
Spring, because they need that summer to adapt and to root adjust so that they can make it through that following winter. You know, a lot of plants, we want to plant them when they're dormant, like in the fall. We don't want to do that with palms. You really want to get them in the ground when you kind of after your first, you know, after your last freeze in the spring. Let them have that whole warm season to kind of root adjust and adapt so that they can make it through that subsequent winter. And with that said, I'll conclude my talk on cold hardy palms, and I'm happy to answer any questions folks may have at a future date. Just email me.